and welcome to People in Power. I'm Barbara Serra. On today's program, conflict in the Caucasus. Georgians say it's a war of foreign aggression. The Russians claim self-defense. But whoever started the fighting, it's civilians who are paying the price. This now also appears to be a war of words, one that the US is becoming increasingly involved in. So how did it start and how will it end? To truly understand this conflict, we need to look back. Ossetians have never wanted to be part of Georgia, but they were absorbed into the Russian Empire as part of Georgia in 1801. Juliana Rufus now has the long timeline of events which have led to this crisis.
In 1917, after the Russian Revolution, Georgia became part of the Soviet Union. Southern Ossetia remained part of Georgia and the north became part of Russia. Although Georgian himself, Stalin played Ossetians and Georgians off against each other as a tactic to keep a grip on the entire region. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, South Ossetians moved to reclaim their independence from Georgia. Aided by Moscow, they fought a brief civil war, broke away and began running their own affairs. An uneasy truce reigned for the next 12 years. But that all changed with the US-backed Rose Revolution.
We just are conducting a peaceful meeting of parliament,
which led to the election of Mikhail Saakashvili, who promised to regain control of breakaway regions South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Sporadic fighting in South Ossetia resumed as Tbilisi unsuccessfully tried to retake the region. Georgia set up a South Ossetian government to rival the one led by Russian-backed Edward Kokoity. With two competing governments struggling for legitimacy and a more belligerent Russia under Vladimir Putin, the stage was set for conflict. The final straw for Russia and Putin was Georgia's bid to join NATO.
Georgia is really a role model for many countries in this region.
Since then, Russia and Georgia have been engaged in a low-key battle, each trying to get the other to show itself to be irresponsible or aggressive. The spark came on the 8th of August, with the heaviest fighting between Georgia and Ossetia since 2004. Following nearly a week of clashes, Georgia launched an attack on the breakaway region. Russia had all the excuse it needed to show Georgia as firebrands, unfit for NATO membership, and, most of all, to show the West that it doesn't want NATO on its doorstep.
Well, joining us now for more from Washington, D.C. is Zeino Baran, Director of the Center for Eurasian Policy at the Hudson Institute. Also in Washington, Steve Levine, commentator and author of Putin's Labyrinth. Thank you both very much for joining us. Steve Levine, if I can start with you. Now, the move that precipitated this conflict was a Georgian attack on South Ossetia. If the president, Mikhail Saakashvili, was hoping that this would reassert Georgian authority on the region, do you think that decision was based on a miscalculation, the miscalculation that NATO and the West was going to help him?
I think he made an instantaneous decision. The Georgians can do that. They can be quite spontaneous. But I do think that the premise of your question is correct, that he, in the back of his mind, did think that he had the U.S. certainly and perhaps NATO behind him. And if he did assume that, then obviously that was a miscalculation.
Let's bring in Zeino Baran. Zeino Baran, these days, whenever there's a war, we ask, right, where's the oil? Explain to us how oil is a factor in all of this.
Well, there's oil and gas out of the Caspian region, basically going through Georgia to Western markets, to European markets. And Georgia is very important because it is the key transit country that allows oil and gas from that region to reach Western markets without Russian control. The rest of the pipelines that go out of the region and in a Western direction are either Russian or Russian-controlled pipelines.
In light of that, do you think the Russians were just waiting for an excuse to exert their influence?
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, the question often asked is who shot first about a week ago. But before then, I mean, it's been about over a year, maybe 2 years. Russians have put embargo on Georgia, and they have tried to provoke the Georgians, which, as my friend Steve said, rightly, they can be sometimes instantaneous, emotional, and I think the Russians knew that, and they wanted to provoke them into taking some sort of a military action in one of the separatist zones, either South Ossetia or Abkhazia, so they would use that as an excuse to come in with tanks.
Now, Steve Levine, back to you. It's not just oil and gas, is it really? In the past few days, we've seen the US sign a deal with Poland over the missile defense shield in Eastern Europe. Now, the US stresses this isn't an anti-Russian move, but surely Russia will see this as a provocation, won't it?
It is a provocation. I think this is Washington's and Poland's reply to Georgia. Let's get that box checked while we still can.
There's been a lot of criticism, this to Steve Levine. Now, there's been a lot of criticism in Georgia and outside that the US and the West didn't really go and help Georgia in its hour of need. Was Mikhail Saakashvili naive to think that they would come to his rescue?
There was a misperception, I think. I think the United States probably fed a perception in Central Asia also and the Caucasus that you sign on to a pro-Western East-West energy corridor, which is what we're talking about, and we'll defend you. And I think the smart players among them knew that would not include sending actual troops, but I have been cheered by some of the reaction that has taken place. The decision by the Ukrainian president and the Lithuanian president to fly to Tbilisi to show their solidarity with Mikhail Saakashvili, and the decision to send in Condoleezza Rice. I think that those are more than symbolic.
Zaino Baran, it's the European countries who would be the biggest beneficiaries of this pipeline from Azerbaijan of oil and gas. And of course, what Georgia really wants is membership of NATO, a membership that they were already quite hesitant about. How do you think that they will play it, seeing as they potentially are the biggest ones, the biggest losers, if Russia gains control of the pipeline?
Well, first of all, in April at the last NATO summit, Georgia and Ukraine tried to get membership action plan for NATO. And the East and Central European countries, as well as America, really pushed for it. And of course, we see some of those East and Central European countries now in Tbilisi supporting Georgia because they have been concerned about the direction Russia was heading under Putin. And of course, Lithuania and Poland and several others, especially Ukraine as well, which is not NATO, of course, but have already experienced oil and gas cutoffs when Moscow was not happy with their foreign policy decisions or other decisions. So those countries and Americans have been trying to bring Georgia closer to the Euro-Atlantic security umbrella. And that's why it was so important in April to give them this membership action plan to sort of bring them one step closer to NATO. But some of the West European countries, especially led by Germany, were not very comfortable with that because they did not want to upset Russia. In addition to that, they didn't want to deal with the Russian-Georgian conflict within NATO. So I think we are going to have both sides saying we were right.
Mr. Levine, we've seen Georgia court the West, court Western media. But what about Russia? Does Russia really care what the West or the rest of the world thinks of its actions?
This is playing extremely well in Moscow, is what I've been hearing about. The Russians are playing this as a humanitarian move against Georgian brutality. They feel that they're on top of the world. Putin is very popular for doing this. And so, no, I don't think they really care what the West thinks, the public thinks.
Just on a very final point, the West has seen mixed messages from Russia. This is also the first time that we see the double act of President and Prime Minister Medvedev and Putin. Do you think they stand united on how to deal with South Ossetia and Georgia?
I think they stand together, but that Medvedev has really lost the moment. He had a moment in the very beginning to take charge and demonstrate that he was the president. He was the one, if anything was going to take place, he was going to do it. And he had pause. He demonstrated that he was not a traditional, strong Russian leader, and Putin had to step in. I won't be surprised if this is Medvedev's only term.
Zaino Baran, I saw you nodding there. Do you agree with that?
I agree completely, because we've seen a couple days after the initial clashes start, Putin immediately from Beijing Olympics flying and being on the ground, posing with the soldiers, pretty much handling the war from the beginning. And in fact, this whole confrontation with Georgia, as well as broader with the West, has been Putin's making, and he's shown that he remains in charge. And I agree with Steve. We'll probably see Medvedev after one term probably be replaced by Putin again.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Zaino Baran and Steve Levine, thank you both very much for joining us. Well, still to come after the break, Islam in China. With the eyes of the world trained on China for the Olympics, local Islamic groups fear a return to the past.
With President Medvedev's signature on the peace plan, this was the day to test compliance. A small EU delegation led by Estonia's foreign minister went to see for themselves. Arriving at the town of Kaspi, Russia's most recent front line, we spot armour and artillery on the hillside, guns pointed towards the town.
A tank hugging the tree line, actually going into the tree line now, reversing into the tree line. To the right of that there's another tank, and above that there's more armoured personnel carriers.
Moments later, and they're on the move, across the escarpment, down into Kaspi, and onto the road to Gori. This could be the first phase of a Russian withdrawal.
The ceasefire agreement has been also signed by Russian president, so that I'd like to see also that ceasefire agreement will be really implemented, so that we're now trying to go to Gori and see if we see any signs that implementation has been started.
Also part of the group is the man who helped broker peace in Bosnia, former US Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. I asked him if he saw
Well, I think there has been ethnic cleansing, but I don't think it's been on both sides. The Russians and their paramilitary militia supporters have clearly done ethnic cleansing. I spent this morning talking to refugees in Tbilisi from the Gori area and from Georgian villages outside Skinvali, and there was ethnic cleansing.
On through Russian checkpoints and into Gori, the road littered with the remnants of war, lined with Russian troops and artillery positions still very much dug in. There is no further evidence of a pullout. At the impromptu Russian command center in Joseph Stalin Square, the diplomats want to know why.
Is the war over?
Of course, replies the Russian commander. Withdraw or not to withdraw, that seems to be the question. The confusion is evident. We've heard that Medvedev has ordered a withdrawal again. We only hear this from television, he tells us.
A brave diplomatic mission into the heart of Russian-controlled Georgian territory to try and verify whether withdrawal is actually taking place. Well, they've left the town of Gori disappointed. It seems the Russians and Georgians signed two completely different peace deals. The diplomats don't know where to go next.
Just over a week ago, this was a quiet town of 55,000 people. As of Saturday night, only a few thousand residents remain. It's now a very quiet town that remains under Russian occupation.
They came for bread, for water, for anything that would make life a little more bearable. and in the crowd, the desperate faces of those worried they'd be left with nothing. For others, they'd waited for days for help like this to arrive.
There are long queues and we don't always manage to get the food. People are falling, pushing each other.
If anything more dangerous happens, we'll have to move.
There are two things the people here in Gori desperately need: aid and security. As you can see, the aid has gotten through, even if it is being distributed a little chaotically. And as for security, well, the people here still don't feel safe.
Away from the centre, these people told us armed militia entered Gori the night before, sending everyone into a panic.
They were drunk and roaming the town before they headed back to the hills. They broke into shops and stole vodka and other drinks.
The shops here are slowly opening, but the shelves are mostly empty. There's little worth buying. Georgia's national security advisor has been here every day since Russian tanks rolled in. He says there's movement, but not a withdrawal.
My impression of what I've seen is that they're deeping inside, the territories and expanding the geographical area of their military presence.
We met Tamas Klimashvili at his home in Gori. He told us he'd hidden from the Russians and worries they won't be going soon.
With pressure from the US and Europe, the Russians are going to pull out. But they'll do it slowly. They haven't fulfilled their plan yet, and they're not in a hurry to leave.
From Gori up to 20 kilometers south, the Russians are there. They're dug in. There's no sign they're moving, even though Moscow says the pullout begins on Monday. One Russian general says these troops were the first in, and they'll be the last out. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, Gori.
Civilians are beginning to return to Skin Valley. The capital seems to be the only place in the region coming back to life. But days on from the ceasefire that brought South Ossetians back, and people are still living on handouts.
There is no water, there is no electricity, there is no infrastructure. We depend on Russians to give us everything.
The bombing destroyed many parts of a city. It's still not clear how many people were killed. Human rights groups accuse the Russians of exaggerating the initial death toll, although locals still insist hundreds were killed and injured. Amelia told me she lost her home and has nothing left.
If the situation is so bad, why have people come back?
Skin Valley is my motherland. There's no place I love more. When I get close to the city, my heart fills with joy.
Well, this is one of the many houses bombed in Skin Valley. Pusar behind me, the father of the household, is trying to rebuild his house as best you can. But as you can see, it's a pretty impossible job.
Across the border in Gori, the situation isn't much better. The town is deserted. The people who've stayed are also without the basics. We found Georgians fighting over a loaf of bread.
Well, I'm here in the centre of Gori. As you can see, it's very much still under the control of the Russians, but the humanitarian situation here is dire. These people say they have no electricity, no food, no water.
We spoke to the man who, according to the Russians, is supposed to be looking after the Georgians here.
As governor of Gori, how concerned are you?
I am very worried. Only a crazy person wouldn't be worried. The main thing is to rebuild this town.
Back in South Ossetia, the Russians are still not allowing any foreign aid through. They say it's too dangerous. For now, the people of Skin Valley continue to live in poverty. Nazanin Bashiri, Al Jazeera, on the South Ossetian-Georgian border.
If it started, it wasn't here. In Gori, which has essentially become the Russian base in this part of Georgia, there was no sign of a pullout. In fact, throughout the day, more men and machines moved deeper into the country rather than pulling back and heading home. By the side of the main highway to Tbilisi, diggers worked to cover tank positions, a sure sign no orders to withdraw had reached here. The Georgians, sitting a short distance away, had little idea about what was happening, even less about how to react. The confusion was clear. At one point, they tried to block the advancing Russians with police cars, but they were simply and comprehensively brushed aside.
From inside Gori, there have been reports of Russian men and machinery on the move all day, but this appears to have been a redeployment of their numbers rather than the widespread withdrawal that the Russians had promised.
The Russians, it seems, were in no rush to leave.
Last night he promised that they will start to be pulling out 10 a.m. today, but I've just called him 20 minutes ago, and he refused to confirm that. He said that the pullout is not the major issue he's dealing now with.
In the fields, the soldiers did what they could to make themselves comfortable on a blazing hot summer day. The Russians insist there are many security issues involved in their withdrawal, and it's clear they'll finish this operation on their own timetable, not one imposed by outsiders. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, Gori.
These are the blackened remains of Georgian homes in South Ossetia. This footage filmed from our Russian convoy seems to back up human rights claims of ethnic cleansing in the region. The villages are almost deserted. Most of the people here managed to get away. As we weren't allowed to get off the bus, we just don't know the fate of those left behind. We did meet one independent witness, a Russian human rights campaigner.
We actually saw some terrible, totally terrible pillage when houses were being put ablaze by the Ossetian militants. When the militants were entering the houses and taking out furniture, rugs, household appliances, pretty much everything, and it was all happening right in front of us.
Tatiana's team managed to take pictures of some of the looting and burning.
Now we spoke to several members of the Ossetian militias, to the militants, that is, and they told us very straightforwardly that they were doing it. And the reason why they were doing it was in order to make sure that the Georgians have new homes to return to.
On the way to Gori, also the scene of intense fighting, we passed more ghost villages. The people here say they have no access to information.
There's no TV, there's no radio. I don't know what's going on. I'm living in a vacuum.
At this South Ossetian refugee center in Vladikavkaz, there seems to be little sympathy for the Georgians.
I wouldn't say they deserved it, but this is war. It hits one side as much as the other, and we can't ignore that both sides were involved in wrongdoings.
The bitterness felt between South Ossetians and Georgians is deep-rooted in years of history. It's difficult for these South Ossetian refugees who basically lost everything in the bombing to imagine ever living side by side with Georgians again. The Russians, possibly embarrassed by what's happening, seem keen to show they're now protecting South Ossetia's Georgian enclave. But their offer of security has come too late for many. Nazanin Moshiri, Al Jazeera, North Ossetia.
Western leaders step up the pressure on Moscow to pull its troops out of Georgia and honour a French-brokered ceasefire agreement. So who are the winners and losers in the conflict over South Ossetia? And as Russia reasserts itself in the Caucasus, what happens now to relations between Moscow and the West? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Western leaders have formed a united front in stepping up the pressure on Moscow to live up to its promise of withdrawing troops from Georgia. France has now said it will call a special EU summit if Russia didn't comply with the agreement. The Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has said his forces will begin withdrawing from Georgia on Monday. But that promised withdrawal doesn't appear to be happening quick enough. Reports suggest the Russians may just be redeploying their troops and in some places actually reinforcing their positions. Well, as the dust settles on the conflict, one thing's becoming clear. Russia has shown that it's capable of imposing its will on South Ossetia and is flexing its muscles in the region. So has the Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, taken a risky gamble and lost? Has he presented Russia a golden opportunity to regain control of its backyard? The conflict has also made the Georgians and other former Soviet states realize that pleas for military help from the West in any confrontation with Russia are unlikely to be heeded. And, of course, the separatist movement in South Ossetia will be in greater control now that Russia has taken over completely. Well, joining us now are our guests in London, Martin Macaulay, an expert on Russia and the Caucasus at the University of London, and in Chicago, Kerry Kavanagh. He's a former US ambassador who served in Moscow and Tbilisi. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Kerry Kavanagh, let me start with you, if I may. Experts say this is one of the most serious standoffs between Russia and the West since the Cold War ended. Are things as bad as that?
I think they are. It isn't as bad as the Cold War, but it is the most serious split, I think, between the two. And I know some people have started asking questions about who are the winners and who are the losers. And it's sad to say, but I think true to say that in this situation, everyone is a loser. We've seen a tragic conflict on the ground. We've seen a tragic engagement by Russia militarily that is causing all of the Western nations to reassess their policies toward them. And we've seen a tragic diplomatic mistake, I think, by a number of parties that led to this conflict. And we run the risk of a tragic overreaction that will make things worse.
Martin Macaulay in London, let's talk about the situation on the ground itself, because Moscow says it will withdraw from Georgian territory once extra security measures are in place, whatever those are. What does that mean on the ground, and will that satisfy the terms of the ceasefire agreement?
Well, basically, it's an unequal relationship because the Russian army can do what it likes in Georgia. It was given carte blanche by the US Defense Secretary saying the United States would not intervene militarily. And when President Sarkozy was in Moscow a week ago, he conceded the right of the Russians to intervene in South Ossetia and Abkhazia to protect Russian citizens and Russian speakers. And therefore, they can expand this further, and you can use the arguments of Sir Thomas Aquinas. You have a moral duty to intervene to protect the weak and helpless and those suffering injustice. So therefore, all these arguments can be used, and the Russians can basically militarily occupy Georgia, and render it really defenseless to make sure that it can never be a military force which will cause Russia any troubles in the future, and also to prevent Georgia joining NATO. So the answer is that the Russian army and Russia at present is dominant, and they really can occupy Georgia, and nobody will intervene. NATO will not intervene militarily. The United States will not intervene, and therefore they know that they can maneuver, they can think what they're going to do, and so on. I think it's very important to note that there are two power groups in Russia. You have President Medvedev, who told President Sarkozy there was going to be a ceasefire. That wasn't honoured. He told Angela Merkel there was going to be a ceasefire. That wasn't honoured. And today we're talking about withdrawal of troops and so on. It may mean, as you say, just relocation. So President Medvedev, if you like, is a diplomatic voice.
Okay.
But the real power is with Putin and the generals in the south, and they are pursuing a security agenda to take control of Georgia.
Okay, well, let's get the view from Moscow now and bring in Dmitry Babich. He's a Russian political analyst. Dmitry Babich, many observers say that Russia has emerged stronger from this conflict. It's been able to impose its will freely on South Ossetia. Is Russia the clear winner in this conflict?
I think we shouldn't talk about it in these terms. I think everyone is the loser, because Georgia is not going to get South Ossetia and Abkhazia back in the near future. Russia is facing this, to my mind, unjustified critique from the West. And the West has shown itself completely impotent to stop first the Georgian attack and then the Russian attack. So everyone is the loser, but the biggest losers are the people who were killed, mostly by the Georgian attack in the first day of the war.
Kerry Kavanagh in Chicago, how much has this conflict shown that the US and the EU are perhaps incapable of supporting their allies in the region, like Georgia?
Well, I think we've known all along that there were severe limits to the amount of military support you could give friends and partners. And it's important to note at this point there's been discussion about NATO membership. In fact, Georgia is not a NATO member. The EU and the United States have been engaged politically. We've been engaged economically. We've given some military training and support, and the Georgians utilized that with their force that was assisting in operations in Iraq. But it's been clear from the beginning this has not been a military alliance. And I think it would be an overstatement by anyone to say that Saakashvili should have anticipated that the United States and the European Union could come to his assistance in a fight with Russia.
Martin McCauley in London. I mean, let's talk about the Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili. How has he come out of this? I mean, he seems to be now gathering US and European support as the man who stood up to a resurgent Russia.
Yes, but at the end of the day, he made the mistake of attacking South Ossetia. He was lured into a Russian trap. The Russians are very good at chess. They played a game of chess. He was provoked, the separatists in South Ossetia provoked the Georgian army. They thought they would take Tsinvali, the capital of South Ossetia, in 24 hours and then move up to the frontier. And perhaps he thought the Russians wouldn't react. He'd have the time really to take control. That was a miscalculation. And I think he miscalculated what help the European Union might give him, but that would be diplomatic, but also most seriously the Americans. He may have thought that the Americans would perhaps warn Russia not to penetrate Georgia. But he was then confronted with the reality that Robert Gates simply said the United States will not intervene militarily, so therefore he was really in a mess. And the Georgian army has been cut to pieces. It hasn't done very well indeed. It's been a surprise. Many of its weapons were better than the Russians, but the Russians won. And the Russian Air Force has total control of the air and so on. Well, so Saakashvili has very limited very limited possibilities here. All he can do now is to say, we are the victims, please come and help us and prevent Tbilisi being taken, prevent the whole of the country falling into anarchy. Please come and help us.
Let's put that issue to Kerry Kavanagh there in Chicago. I mean, how embarrassing is President Saakashvili for the West? I mean, this is a man who was championed by Washington, but he's failed to impose Georgian control over South Ossetia.
Well, I think our view has been for a long time that he could not impose such control militarily, and indeed we've encouraged him to work on political solutions. The West, through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has been trying to address the problem in South Ossetia since the formation of the Republic of Georgia. And indeed, the United Nations has been working on the conflict in Abkhazia. It was understood there was no military solution to those problems. The embarrassment, I think, is that he took a step that was clearly unacceptable to all parties, both the United States, both the Europeans, and the Russians, of attempting to militarily resolve this. And what Martin said is very much true. The Russian military forces have prevailed here, but that should be no surprise with the Russian military force 25 times the size of Georgia in a very deep and strong military tradition. I don't think anyone could have ever guessed that there would be a possibility to surgically take South Ossetia and keep it. That's just not realistic from a military standpoint, and it's not realistic from a political standpoint.
Okay, let's bring in back Dmitry Babich in Moscow. Dmitry Babich, what do you see as the wider regional impact of this conflict? I mean, what will countries, for example, like Ukraine, who want to move closer to the West, what will they be thinking after they've seen what's happened to Georgia?
Well, I think that the general implications will be negative. The only positive thing that can happen is that the other states which have separatist entities on their territory, namely Azerbaijan and Moldova, will think twice before trying a military solution.
Martin McCauley in London, let me bring you back here into the discussion. I mean, what's this conflict done for the separatist movement in South Ossetia? I mean, will they now have much more control, perhaps?
Yes, you can look forward to South Ossetia being under South Ossetian control, which basically means Russian control. There will be a strong Russian military presence there to protect the separatists there, and if you like, it will de facto leave Georgia. The same thing will happen in Abkhazia. Then you have the situation, what happens if the Georgian army attempts to shell South Ossetia or attempts to shell Abkhazia and so on. And again, you might have war again, because basically the Russians will be saying, you can't touch South Ossetia, you can't touch Abkhazia, you've lost these two territories. And we should remember that over the last couple of 100 years, both these territories wanted to leave Georgia. They've been associated with Georgia, but they really wanted to leave Georgia, and they're ethnically and linguistically different. And I think this war means that they've now separated from Georgia.
I mean, Kerry Kavanagh in Chicago, we know, for example, that Georgia very much wanted NATO membership. That's not something that Russia wanted. But what sort of message is Russia sending out to Washington and the EU?
Well, I think Russia has been sending a message for a while, and I think there's been a problem in that message has not been fully acknowledged. I come from Florida. President Bush comes from Texas. Both have one thing in common, and it's a lot of snakes. And we have a snake called a rattlesnake. And rattlesnakes are dangerous, but if you leave them alone, they leave you alone. And if you get too close, they start to rattle their tail. Well, Moscow started rattling its tail as the United States began talking about missile defense systems in Poland and in the Czech Republic. Moscow rattled its tail when the United States and other Western countries pushed for recognition of Kosovo. Moscow rattled its tail when the United States withdrew from the ABM treaty, and the rattling became its loudest as we pushed in April for membership of both Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. I think it highlights a diplomatic mistake. I apologize for equating Russia with a snake, but the snake is clearly bitten. And the way to handle that kind of situation is to acknowledge the rattling, and then you approach the situation very carefully and very gingerly. And I think among the failures that we've seen here, and the biggest failure was actually Putin's decision to go in as heavily as he has into Russia, but there has been a diplomatic failure in not taking greater account of Russian interests, and that Russia, in standard diplomatic parlance, had been voicing those interests.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll talk about some of those failures in the second part of the show, but it's time for a short break now. But when we come back, how will the conflict shape how the West and Russia do business in the future? Stay with us, won't you? Welcome back. Well, there are some clear winners and losers in the fight over South Ossetia, and the conflict has shown there could be a need for a fresh start in how the West and Russia do business. So, what are the possible options for the West in dealing with a stronger and more assertive Russia? Well, America has already cancelled some military exercises with Russia. There could also be attempts to block Russian membership of the World Trade Organization. And they could slow negotiations on a new economic partnership. And visa restrictions could also be tightened. But Western leaders will need to tread carefully in dealing with Moscow. Russia remains the main supplier of energy to Europe. It could very well leverage its vast gas and oil supplies to counter any Western attempts at imposing sanctions. But the question is, will any of these measures deter Russia from reasserting itself in the Caucasus? Well, let's rejoin our guests now. In Moscow, Dmitry Babich, a Russian political analyst. In London, Martin Macaulay, an expert on Russian affairs. And in Chicago, Kerry Kavanagh, a former US ambassador to Moscow. Dmitry Babich, in Moscow, how will this conflict affect Russian relations with the West? I mean, after the dust has settled, will it be business as usual?
Well, there was a lot of rhetoric from the West, but I don't see how the West can really influence Russia, in what way it can punish Russia. Of course, the United States can further postpone Russia's membership in WTO, but the problem is it will not damage Putin or Medvedev politically, because the attitude to WTO in Russia fluctuates from neutral to negative. WTO membership is needed by several Russian big companies, but people in general are mostly negative about it. The West can stop supplying food and medicine to Russia, but that would hit primarily the European business interests. Excluding Russia from G8 also will not deliver anything, because basically Russia's membership in G8 was largely formal. We could not stop the West from taking any unpleasant decisions. The United States or the European Union never made concessions to Russia since 1990. So these military exercises, I think that Moscow can survive without military exercises with NATO members. So I don't see how the West can influence.
Okay,
really.
it's an important point you make. Let's bring in Martin Macaulay there in London. Martin Macaulay, Russia wants to be integrated into the world economic system and be taken seriously as a global diplomatic player. I mean, how much do both sides need each other, really?
Both sides need each other because there are tremendous problems facing the world, and this conflict is a tragedy because Russia and America and Europe are basically all on the same side. They share a common culture and so on. And they are confronted by great challenges from the Islamic world and also from the rise of China, the tremendous economic and political rise of China. So this is a tragedy. But Dmitry Babic is right. America and the European Union really have no levers to punish Russia. And I don't think they will try to do it because Russia is has integrated in the global economy. Russian companies, their initial public offerings in the London Stock Exchange and so on, and these are going on. These are unlikely to be stopped. They raise capital in London. London is one of the financial capitals of the world. The financiers at this moment in time, with the economy in trouble, will not want to lose any Russian business. That'll be the argument to Prime Minister Gordon Brown. We don't want to have bad relations with Russia because we could lose money. So Russia economically is integrating. This is the paradox. Economically, Russia is integrating and becoming a world player. But from the security point of view, it's not. The United States, perhaps NATO as a whole, have neglected Russia's legitimate security rights. Then in foreign policy, there's a lot of aggravation in foreign policy and so on, and the two sides are really trading insults, and the rhetoric over the last 10 days has been rather unfortunate.
Kerry Kavanagh, in Chicago, I mean, how much leverage is there that the West can use against Russia? I mean, presumably, if too much pressure is put on Moscow, they can just turn off those gas pipes prior to winter and Europe will freeze.
That's right, but I don't think that's going to happen. And I think we've already heard the levers are not significant here. And the importance of maintaining Russia as a serious international player is key to all involved. And I don't think this is going to become a matter of money or a matter of business. It's very much a matter of politics. There's recognition in Washington, there's recognition in Brussels that we need a healthy partnership with Russia. And I think the task for today is how do you solidify this ceasefire? How do you start advancing peace efforts in these frozen conflicts in the Caucasus and elsewhere so you don't run the risk of another miscalculation like this? And that should be the focus, not how do you punish Russia. And I think in terms of Russia's relationship, this is going to be a challenge for all parties. It's going to be a challenge for Russia, and a challenge for the United States, and a challenge for the European Union.
Dmitry Babic in Moscow, I mean, does the West perhaps need to acknowledge that Russia did have a case? I mean, does it need to explain why the West helped Kosovo on the one hand, but questioned Russia's right to help South Ossetia on the other?
Well, that's exactly the question which is being asked in Moscow all the time. Because basically Russia copied the actions of NATO in Yugoslavia. NATO and Yugoslavia not only pushed the Yugoslav army out of Kosovo, it also tried to immobilize Milosevic's military force. In the same way, Russia not only pushed the Georgian army out of South Ossetia, but also tried to immobilize Georgian army. There was no intention to take Tbilisi. In the same way, when the West speaks about disproportionate use of force by Russia, we can remind the West of 2006 when Israel, because of 5 soldiers being taken hostage, just destroyed the infrastructure of Lebanon. In South Ossetia, more than 1,000 people were killed. So this is much more of a reason to damage Georgian infrastructure.
I want to get a final thought from Martin McCall in London. I mean, there'll be a new US president in a few months' time. How do you see the new administration shaping relations with Moscow in light of the conflict in Georgia?
Well, you can say he's got a tabula rasa. He can start from nothing. He's not to blame for if it's Obama, if it's Barack Obama. The Democrats could say the Republicans made a mess of it. Let's start from the beginning again. Let's build a new relationship. And I think that's what Obama will do. He's in a very, very good position to go to Moscow and say, OK, let's make a fresh start. We both made mistakes in the past, but we should really work together because there's a problem of nuclear weapons in Iran. There's a problem of nuclear bombs in North Korea. There's so many things that we can work together on. We should be doing this, and it'll benefit both of us.
Kerry Cavan in Chicago, a final thought from you. I mean, what happens now to the issue of NATO membership for the former Soviet countries like Georgia and Ukraine, for example?
I think it's very important for the alliance to highlight that no country has the ability to veto who can be a member or not, but it's equally important to approach gingerly when and how. And NATO membership is a very significant thing. Attack against one is viewed as an attack against all. And I think there has to be some reservations as we move ahead on those questions for new members as to how quickly that could occur.
OK, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Kerry Kavanagh in Chicago, Dmitry Babich in Moscow, and Martin McCauley in London. Thank you all very much indeed for your time. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.
Alan is a student from South Ossetia. He reads about the conflict in the national newspapers, but has first-hand experience. He was in Skinvali when the bombs started to fall. Instead of leaving, he joined the separatists.
I saw with my own eyes a car on fire with the family inside, mother, father and their child. The mother was able to get out before the tank fired at it. The father and the child were burnt alive in the car. It's hard to explain with words what was happening to them.
The war ravaged both Ossetian and Georgian communities. Homes turned to rubble. But in the early days of the fighting, South Ossetian officials insisted up to 2,000 people had been killed, a figure the Russian government said justified a full-scale offensive. But independent sources discredit the figures.
They've found thus far 44 civilians killed on the Ossetian side. Now that's 44 too many, and that's clearly unacceptable. But the Russian propaganda machine is clearly working very hard right now.
The death toll has been difficult to verify, with few independent observers on the ground. South Ossetia's envoy to Moscow insists international observers have not counted the dead properly.
These are our victims, not the casualties of the Human Rights Watch or anyone else. God save them and their countries from experiencing what we've experienced.
But as the dust settles on the conflict zones, the war of words is becoming a war of numbers, as both sides paint each other as the aggressor. The Russian government have sent 150 investigators to the region to look into allegations of ethnic cleansing. This as Tbilisi calls for international observers to examine the damage caused by Russian troops. And as both sides mount evidence against each other, civilians on the ground are still counting the cost of their own private tragedies. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
The Russian army on the move. For the first time since the beginning of this conflict, we witnessed the initial stages of a pullout.
After peacekeeping, checkpoints have been established. A more intense withdrawal will take place after the 22nd. The setting up of additional peacekeeping checkpoints is governed by the situation on the ground.
But the Russian military has also made it clear that deployments of troops will remain south of the de facto border with South Ossetia. They claim the force will be part of a peacekeeping contingent that's been here since 1992. That's something that will no doubt anger Georgia and the Americans, who are demanding a complete withdrawal. This is nothing like the kind of withdrawal Georgia and the West are looking for. These are only 10 tanks that say they're on the move, heading back to Vladikavkaz. This is a city that still doesn't have enough food or water. These Georgians told us they're hungry.
We think they have food in there, we don't know, but they're not giving it to us. Why?
This is the man supposedly looking after the humanitarian situation. Who is in charge here now in Gori? Have the Russians left?
Well, Russian soldiers are there now. They are stealing everything. They're even taking the toilets. I'm going there now to film it.
Nobody seems to know who's in charge here. The Russians may have started to pull out, but they haven't loosened their grip on the region. This part of Georgia is still very much under Russian control. Nazanin Bashiri, Al Jazeera, Gori.
30 kilometers from the Georgian capital, the Russians are still heavily dug in. If there is a pullback underway, there's no sign of it here. Outside the village of Igoiti, Georgian civilians are on the march. Among them a group of doctors preparing for a confrontation.
We want Russia to stop its aggression in Georgia, and we're doctors here against Russian violence, and we want the Red Army to go home.
Who's the photograph that you're carrying with you?
He's my colleague. He was a doctor in Gori Hospital and he was killed by Russian army.
The Russians say that they'll have pulled back from Georgia proper by Friday afternoon. I think it's beginning to dawn on Georgians that that simply isn't going to happen. These are ordinary people, a group of doctors, civilians from surrounding villages on their way to confront the Russians and tell them that it's time to go. A crowd has gathered at the Russian checkpoint near Igoiti. This is the deepest point inside Georgia where the Russian presence is still visible. Fear for these people has given way to anger now. It's time to leave. This is not your country, the Georgians scream. South Ossetia is Russian, this soldier insists. You started all this by bombing Russian citizens. The Georgians are here to make their feelings plain, to tell the Russians to go. They want their country back. But as ever in war, there are opposing viewpoints. The Georgians know South Ossetia is legally theirs. The Russians believe Georgia gave up any lingering right to the place after its massive artillery assault on Skinvali almost 2 weeks ago. They're unlikely to find any common ground. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Igoiti, Georgia.
Russian troops left the strategically important town of Gori in central Georgia. They moved out of the town of Igoeti, their closest position to the Georgian capital. And to the west, a large armored column left the Senaki military base and headed into Abkhazia. But from the Black Sea port of Poti, there were reports that Russian soldiers were digging a trench at a checkpoint that they were guarding. With more details, here's Jonah Hull.
This is as far forward as it's possible to get to watch the Russian withdrawal. 4 p.m. local time, and first the road to Tbilisi, then the Georgian town of Gori begin emptying of Russian forces. Considering the many delays in getting to this point, it looks like a swift exit. The commander of Russian forces in Georgia had said they'd be gone by the evening. This one of the Russian checkpoints has just been given the order to leave. The engine is running, the troops are on board, they're getting ready to leave, and just down the road here, with Gori in that direction, you can probably make out a column of armor and troops, troop carriers and the like, also preparing to take to the road towards South Ossetia, Skinvali, and eventually perhaps onwards to Russia. But this is not a total withdrawal. The Russians prefer to call it a pullback. In Moscow, the deputy chief of Russia's defense staff explained units would remain, both in South Ossetia and in a security buffer zone stretching 7 kilometers from South Ossetia into Georgia itself. They say they'll also retain control of a key highway linking the Georgian capital Tbilisi to the sea. It is far from clear how these Russian stipulations will go down in terms of the peace process. There is no specific provision for them in the peace plan. Just outside Gori, the Georgian police are waiting for the all-clear to enter the town. It means the end of war and nothing else, said this man. We've been waiting for this all along. This war should never have started. We didn't need it. These are anxious moments, as no one can be 100% certain Gori and its surrounding military bases are completely free of both Russian troops and South Ossetian irregulars. And they've no idea what they'll find when they get there. Explosions have been heard around Gori, the Russians destroying military infrastructure as they depart. The withdrawal is good news for the humanitarian situation in Georgia. Aid groups restricted in their work by the Russian presence will now be able to reach previously inaccessible areas. At the military hospital in the town of Gori, the displaced are still arriving. Most are elderly and tired. Some are sick. They still appear shocked by the events of the last 2 weeks that have reduced their lives to this.
There is still shooting every day. We have to hide in our gardens. We can no longer deal with this.
Most of the work we will really focus on in Skin Valley and also on this side is access to people who are still detained, being able to help people who are separated get back together, or at least be in contact so they know where they are, looking for missing people, and also where there are people, where there are mortal remains that need to be brought back to the families.
The bus is heading for better care in Tbilisi. The bulk of the Russian army has left in the opposite direction, and there will be some hope now that the tens of thousands of displaced and refugees can think of heading home. Not all will find it possible. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Gori.
Russia's parliament shows its support for Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Both chambers of the House vote unanimously to put forward an appeal for independence to the Kremlin. Members here seem moved by the statements from both these breakaway regions' presidents.
Today, as President of South Ossetia, in the name of the Parliament of South Ossetia, in the name of the people of South Ossetia, we express our gratitude to you. Once again, I appeal to the President of the Russian Federation to recognize South Ossetia as a sovereign, independent state.
Neither Abkhazia nor I allow myself to speak for South Ossetia, nor South Ossetia will ever again be part of one state with Georgia. And we ask you to cross that barrier, which has for many years been difficult to do, and to recognize our republics as independent.
What's happening in the Duma chamber behind these walls is more a show of solidarity. The Russian MPs just don't have the power to have the final say. That rests with the Russian president. But Dmitry Medvedev must realize that any recognition of Abkhazia or South Ossetia could spark another confrontation in the Caucasus. This is why the Russians say the two regions should never be in Georgian hands again. This photo exhibition of the Duma, proof they claim of war crimes in Skin Valley in South Ossetia. The Russians appear to be using this as an excuse to keep troops on Georgian soil. These latest pictures from the Black Sea port of Poti show Russian soldiers digging in. According to Russia's top generals, they will inspect cargo here on a regular basis. The situation in the Black Sea is already tense enough. A US Navy destroyer carrying humanitarian aid arrived over the weekend. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev says Russia is now prepared to break all ties with NATO if it has to. From the Georgian perspective, even if the President of Russia does recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, it's highly unlikely the West will follow. Under international law, the breakaway regions are still part of Georgian territory.
A large part of our territory remains under Russian occupation, and Russia looks like it's not going to withdraw its forces from these territories. Moreover, it is trying to justify the occupation, which was one of the reasons for their aggression. This is as unjustified as Stalin's attack against Finland.
As these war games continue, it's ordinary civilians who are suffering. Thousands of Georgians still have nowhere to go. They know if Abkhazia and South Ossetia are recognized by Russia, they have very little chance of returning to their homes. Nazanin Mashiri, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Tristan Somhashvili has been living in Gori's refugee camp for just 24 hours. The tent he shares with 4 others provides shelter. Aid agencies give them food and hopefully soon some mattresses. Many of the people living here fled as soon as the fighting between Russia and Georgia began 3 weeks ago. But Tristan hid at home, only deciding to leave after witnessing the death of his 72-year-old neighbour. He says he saw the old woman being drowned by 3 South Ossetian soldiers serving in the Russian military.
Whoever did this is not human. What can I say about people who could do this to a 72-year-old woman? These Ossetians are doing this with the support of the Russians.
He says her crime was that she was South Ossetian but married a Georgian and chose to live peacefully among them instead of the breakaway province. It's impossible to verify the story independently. Our attempts to visit the village ended at a Russian checkpoint. The well-dug-in post is at least 20 kilometres on Georgia's side of the border, in clear violation of the ceasefire agreement. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev says military posts like these are part of a buffer zone required around the border. But Tristan Somhashvili has a clear message for him.
I would tell Medvedev to leave my country alone. Georgia is an independent country and Russia has no right to intervene in our internal affairs.
Nobody in this camp knows when or if they'll ever return home, but life goes on as best it can. In other parts of Gori, the rebuilding of homes is underway. Locals say a Russian airstrike killed 5 people in this building and 4 in the one next door.
These war-ravaged shells don't look like they could ever be someone's home again. But the plan is not to knock them down, but rather rebuild from what's left, so those who survived can eventually return home.
Repairing the building is much easier than erasing the memory of the day the bombs fell, but some are ready to try and move on.
I don't feel hatred towards anyone. Russians, Ossetians and Armenians all live here. I just want to live in peace.
Peace is a dream shared by victims on both sides of this conflict, but for now it remains fragile at best. Dan Nolan, Al Jazeera, Gori, Georgia.